Welcome to the Longevity Protocol with Dr. Cristina Bosch and Dr. John A. Robinson. We'll be your guides to uncovering the secrets to optimal health, better sex, and happiness. From debunking aging myths to exploring the science behind what it means to live the Longevity Protocol, we'll dive into a wide range of topics. So, get ready for an exhilarating journey into what it means to live well and feel your very best at any age. We're back. Stress.
Yes.
Stress. And how stress affects our body, our hormones, how stress affects our just overall ability to function in the world.
Well, technically, the stressors affect us. The stress is the response.
Right. So our ability to be able to interpret stress and filter it.
Manage the stress response, yeah.
Manage the stress response. And that is, I think that people have different coping mechanisms, sort of their own habits to be able to help with that. But there are physiological things that affect the ability to cope with stress or stress resilience. We talk quite a bit about muscle all the time, and muscle is probably one of the key things that helps with stress resilience. Just having muscle, maintaining muscle helps us to have stress resilience. But there's some other hormonal things that are part of that whole process as well.
And of course, the act of building that muscle, movement, exercise, helps manage stress. So usually you're getting a multifaceted benefit from any lifestyle change, right? So being thinner, we talk about fat loss, we talk about muscle building. So losing fat. Well, how do you successfully lose fat and keep it off? You have to manage your blood sugar, eating with frequency. When you are eating with frequency, you're putting less of a burden on the demands of cortisol and are therefore better able to manage your stress response.
Yeah, you just said the key hormonal word there, cortisol. Yeah. And people talk about that.
Apparently.
A lot, yes. Yes, we've been hearing more about that. What was it?
The cortisol face?
The cortisol face. I mean, I know what it is sort of medically, but
I think it's fun. I mean, I know I make fun of it, but I also think it's great. Like, how did that get started? Who heard that little tidbit?
Yeah.
And it used to be adrenal fatigue. Remember, everything and anything was about adrenal fatigue, 20 years ago?
Right. And the adrenals are these little glands that sit on top of the kidneys. They secrete adrenaline, hence the name, plus cortisol is another key hormone. There's other hormones, but cortisol is one of the key ones the adrenals are secreting. So yeah, everyone was talking. What I remember, aside from the adrenal fatigue word that got coined and talked about quite a bit, people talk about, I'm gaining weight because I have too much cortisol, and the cortisol makes me gain weight, particularly around the belly, the center, maybe in the visceral, the organ fat. And there's some truth to that, but everyone was just sort of saying, well, I'm fat. I have fat because I have cortisol. And that was the focus. And again, there's maybe truth to that, but it might not necessarily be the whole picture. But it is true that the cortisol is part of that. But back to the cortisol face. So what does that mean? What did they meant?
That people on social were saying that they were getting round, swollen, fat faces because of cortisol. And the thing is, it's not about too much or too little cortisol either. It's about the dysfunction of the cortisol. Neither one of those is a good thing. We don't want low amounts of cortisol, and we don't want high amounts of cortisol. We want them, cortisol should be released with a very nice circadian rhythm that kind of flows with the sun. So your peak in general is around 6 a.m., typically around when the sun is rising. And then you have a nice gentle decline to taper off, so that by 9 p.m., you're definitely able to sleep well, with 3 a.m. being probably the end of the lull of cortisol, and then it starts gently cycling back up.
Well, hold on. I'm going to keep coming back to
I like that.
I love that. And that certainly has a lot to do with the cortisol. I'm harping back on this, the face thing, the cortisol face, because that is related to an actual true symptom called moon facing, which is related to hyper cortisolemia, or what's called Cushing's disease.
Right.
So there's a thing. So, I mean, you kind of see what people are saying, but most people are not walking, that maybe have cortisol dysfunction or adrenal dysfunction, you were saying. Most don't have full-blown Cushing's disease, or the opposite of not enough is called Addison's disease. Most are not walking around that way that we're sort of generally dealing
if
with.
they do, the round face that went away after a month of not drinking is not going to cure it. That's,
Right.
I mean, that's the thing about the adrenals. You know, I always used to describe them to people, or I still do, I guess, as like these nice plump little grapes, because they're about the size of a grape sitting on your kidneys, like you mentioned. And through strain and stress and different hormonal influences, which we'll talk about, they start going from this nice plump little grape to this shriveled up little raisin. Yeah.
Right.
And it's a really nice analogy because you can reconstitute a raisin to a certain extent. You can reconstitute your adrenals.
Yeah.
This Cushing's and Addison's, that's not what we're referencing in social media. And that's not what we're referencing now. Those are very dramatic endocrine diseases that need to be properly diagnosed, and therefore following a very conventional method of treatment with supportive methods. But we're talking about that stuff in the middle. We're talking about adrenal dysfunction.
Yeah. So yeah, the thousand shades of gray in the middle of this sort of black and white concept of too much or too little.
Yeah.
Truly diseased too much or too little. It's true. And I think what we tend to see when we test for it, and looking at that circadian rhythm you were mentioning before, we see patients that actually have plenty of overall cortisol. It's just their circadian rhythm is all screwed up.
Yeah, but I would say that's probably the most common thing. Mm-hmm. So you're high when you should be low and flip-flop.
Right.
Mm-hmm. That's that like wired but tired feeling.
Yeah, let's talk about the symptoms. I mean, what if a patient's coming in to see you and you're kind of feeling out that this is probably an adrenal presentation, what does that look like to you?
Well, again, remember that you just said the thousand shades of gray. So you're going on a spectrum. From normal function to dysfunction can be flip-flopped, or you're starting to get past just dysfunction and a flip-flop production of cortisol to now you're just underproducing cortisol. Mm-hmm. So you're thinking about symptoms like, I'm exhausted, but I can't rest, belly fat, I eat, and then I don't feel well. I have a hard time managing my blood sugar. Maybe you get that typical dysglycemia where you're getting nauseous and dizzy, and
the immune system
you start having more frequency of infection. Sleep disruption is a big one. You make a mountain out of a molehill.
Yeah,
someone sneezes and you have this exaggerated startle response, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, sensitivity to light. People will say that as well, like sensitivity to anything.
Just hypersensitive.
Some patients will say, because what happens is they'll get this sort of low blood pressure presentation, or even constitutionally, people that tend to go towards adrenal dysfunction often have this standard 90/60 presentation.
Or they, especially when they go from sitting to standing, or, you know, they get like a little dizzy. Their blood pressure will drop when they have a change in position.
Yeah. And part of the reason that, so people understand, the adrenals will kick in fractions of a second in order to secrete hormone to make the blood vessels contract in order to keep the blood up in your head. Mm-hmm. So if you stand up suddenly, your body should be able to compensate to keep blood in your head. But if the adrenals are a little bit sluggish and not able to kind of rip out that hormone rapidly, then the whole thing doesn't work. The blood pressure doesn't push back up to the head, and then you feel sort of lightheaded.
Yeah, lightheaded. I was going to say, what's the expression?
Yeah, and patients will say, I ask them, do you always feel like when you're standing there, you just want to hold on to something? Because I never really feel fully stable. And so I just kind of hold on to the chair, the desk next to me in order to feel stable. And so the adrenals are kind of kicking in to help with that sort of blood pressure regulation.
And the adrenals are involved in so many different aspects. So, I mean, if we're talking about the adrenals and not just cortisol, then the adrenals, you want to think of the anatomy of the adrenals as having 3 separate layers. And remember in med school, they would teach you salt, sugar, sex. The deeper you go, the sweeter it gets. And when you're thinking about salt, sugar, and sex, what does that actually mean? The outside layer of the adrenal gland is salt regulation. So salt regulation is going to be things like water retention, ability to sweat, blood pressure, because it's about volume and how well you're holding on to the volume.
Right.
The sugar is going to be what people are more commonly talking about.
Yeah, and the salt, by the way, just the salt, because I keep coming back, because we might as well try to talk a little bit about this what they call,
the cortisol
face.
Yeah.
Because that is aldosterone, which is not cortisol. So they keep saying, which is regulating sodium in a different way, which they could be having those sodium handling issues. And that's
right. So you might just be swollen, not actually fat in the face. So,
or not from the cortisol per se.
Adrenal face maybe is better than the cortisol face.
Right.
And then the sugar is going to be maybe another cause of fat face because you're having blood sugar regulation issues, more prone to fat storage, sugar cravings that aren't satisfying you. So salt cravings can be that first stage. And then the last piece will be that inner portion of the adrenal that is going to be involved in sex. How so? Well, it's producing DHEA, which is a precursor for testosterone. The adrenals are pretty powerful little.
If you don't have them, you're dead. I mean, you can't live without adrenals.
You don't got it, you die.
Well, in this particular
but it's true.
case, some organs we can live without, but that is not
the adrenals.
One of them. Right.
And if they're not working well, you don't feel well.
Right. And this is what we're kind of talking about. Back to the salt thing, because we can certainly talk eventually about treatment and what somebody would do. And salt is very often one of the treatments for this because they feel like they need the salt, and that's because they do.
They do.
And there's a mineral imbalance, and so many people are actually salt deficient.
Well, so many people are on low salt diets.
Right, because they've been sort of told this, and then that's been part of the sort of lie since roughly the 1980s.
It was just like oversimplification, a reductionistic answer to a more complex physical and physiologic
Most people
problem.
are not salt sensitive in how that affects their blood pressure.
No, it's the quality of the salt that is going to be affecting the nicking of the blood blood vessels, and there's so many micronutrients in good quality salt.
Yeah, the minerals, right? That's what we're looking for. So we use and been telling patients for years, Celtic sea salt. This has all 82 known minerals to man in it. It's everything is there. It's a very complete whole food salt. And in fact, about 82% of it is sodium chloride. If it's just straight up table salts, that's like 99.9% sodium chloride. So this has got a lower sodium chloride content, and the rest of it is minerals and sort of water content. That Celtic sea salt, we ripped through it.
And the fleur de mal. So, and the point here is that it's got to be from an ocean source, because people will talk about the benefits of Himalayan sea salt. Himalayan salt, which is also good, but it's not doing this.
It's got some potential problems, and this is my sort of bias and my understanding. Himalayan sea salt is coming from a landlocked source. And that theoretically, that the full array of minerals, it wouldn't have the full array potentially. Because when you're getting sea salt, you're getting everything recuperated from volcanic activity, and it's into the sea. You're just getting this full sort of array. And so that's one problem. But put that aside, and let's just assume it's got basically everything in there that's roughly the same as what would be in Celtic sea salt. The other problem is the arsenic levels and the other contaminants that we've seen, and where is it coming from, and is it coming from China, and these other things that are going to have problems potentially with the sourcing of it. And India often has a lot of additional heavy metals and things in it that can be a problem. So I'm sure that and maybe people could tell us, I'm sure there's really good pure versions of this that are a little bit more tried, true, and literally tested. Then maybe that would be okay. But the Celtic sea salt, it's made and produced, harvested, I should say, off the Brittany coast in France, hand rakes. These are ancient salt beds they've been using forever. The Brittany coast in France there is just as pristine as it can be in terms of the source. Although...
and very pretty.
Is it? I was just reading about microplastics again, and these microplastics that are just found in everything. And I've always said for years about the Brittany coast in France and how wonderful it is, and this is where we get our salt from. And now these microplastics we should definitely, this is a little bit of a tangent, and we probably could have mentioned this in the other podcast. But yes, these microplastics are just ubiquitous. I mean, it's just everywhere. So it's even in these more pristine waters, they're finding microplastics. I digress to some degree, but it is related. So back to the adrenals and salt being something that is part of the symptomatic picture and what's happening there, the craving of salt actually being part of the treatment. But let's talk about, or is there any other symptoms? You really, I think, explained most of them. I mean, good old fashioned fatigue. I mean, if we emphasize,
right, of course,
I'm just exhausted.
I think what's important about adrenal dysfunction is that it's the kind of symptoms that one gets really used to living with. So a lot of times a person doesn't realize how unwell they are, because it's so much, even more so than thyroid, even so much more than some of these other hormones we work with, has so much to do with the way you're living your day to day.
Absolutely. That's one of the great things I think about what we do. We help to just bring awareness to people, or they help to bring awareness to themselves, to the conversation, to the process.
Yeah.
I always say, does a fish know it's in water? No, it's in water, doesn't know the difference. So people are often in the midst of stress, they don't realize it, or they're in the midst of having problems, or that they don't realize symptoms, whatever. I don't know, that's all the way it always was. Or I ask a patient, are you constipated? No, I'm not constipated. I go every week.
Right.
Once a week I go. I'm very regular. Every Sunday I go. No, but to them, they're very regular because they go once a week. Right. They just literally thought that was normal. No one had either taught them or shown them that was a problem, or just never came up. People aren't always necessarily talking to their friends about their bowel movements. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But it's this interrogation, discussion, openness, willingness can really help people to understand, and then through that information, help to empower themselves towards healing.
Well, and like you said, how often are people talking about bowel movements? It's kind of like with the adrenals. There's symptoms that aren't flashy or fancy or dramatic. Those really great ads that talk about how the challenge with mental illness is that people can't see it. You know how they say that's part of what makes it so hard. I think that's sort of what happens with adrenal dysfunction as well. There's nothing outstanding about the way a person is feeling when they're starting to have problems with their adrenals. They just don't feel well.
Yeah.
And especially in our culture, people are used to just not feeling good and pushing anyway. And they don't have to.
Yeah. And not seeking out wellness.
Seeking out wellness.
We're seeing a shift. I continue to say it. There is a shift and a renewed understanding, perhaps even a full new understanding of wellness, and literally what I think is our right towards wellness and health.
And our responsibility.
And inevitably with the right
wellness
comes a responsibility.
With
yes.
Great power.
Power comes great responsibility. Spider-Man.
The uncle.
Yes. So how are you going to diagnose it? So a patient's going to come in. There a lot of the diagnoses.
Symptom surveys are big.
Sure. So they kind of describe the symptoms.
Yeah.
It's looking pretty clear, but we've learned to not quite attack it unless we know what's going on with that circadian.
Well, the thing is about the testing is that symptom surveys are big in identifying that there's a problem with the adrenals, but unless you understand what that problem is, remember, like I was describing about the circadian rhythm, then you may inadvertently completely treat it the wrong way if you don't actually know what the cortisol release is. And this is specific to cortisol.
Cortisol now. Yeah. Okay.
So
let's talk about that. What's the test for that?
Well, our favorite, I think after all these years, continues to be, I find it to be extremely reliable, is a salivary cortisol ×4, which means you're collecting a saliva sample 4 times within a 24-hour period, documenting the time at which you drew the sample, and then a graph can be a quantitative and therefore qualitative graph is provided for the patient and physician to understand when are you producing cortisol and at what quantity.
Yeah.
Or releasing.
The conventional way to check it, which by the way, what you're describing there, that salivary cortisol test, that is gold standard when it comes to a lot of research. I think from a strict endocrinology standpoint, they're going to look at serum, blood.
Yeah.
And a common way is to say, well, it's an AM cortisol, but that's just that one little snapshot. It's not letting us know. For a lot of people, they're very anxious when they get their blood drawn, so that's going to affect it.
Right.
That's what's great about the salivary. It's just we usually say do it on a weekend when you're not super stressed out. Yeah. Do it at home, spit in a little thing 4 times, you're done. And therefore, it's as accurate as it can be. I think probably more accurate than blood.
I think it's more clinically useful.
Clinically useful for the majority of people.
Yeah.
Again, we're back to this idea of Addison's and Cushing's.
Different story.
Different story.
Different
and
story.
The blood test and other dexamethasone suppressions and different things that they're doing that are going to really diagnose that black and white extreme. But what we're generally going to see with most of how patients are going to present, and what a lot of people are probably out there right now feeling, is these gray levels. And the best way to check that is the salivary cortisol test.
So how are you going to treat it? Again, assuming we're talking about the area in the middle between true adrenal excess and deficiency. Okay, so for the purposes of this conversation, that's what we're talking about. Yeah. Once you have the true graph of your circadian release, then you are going to either stimulate or suppress cortisol production. So the idea, of course, is if you're low in the morning, you want to stimulate cortisol. Now, depending on how deficient your cortisol production is, you're going to want to replace with actual hydrocortisone.
That's what I really wanted to talk about today. There's the usual suspects of the adrenal herbs, things we've been using also.
Oh yeah, so
years.
Many
great ones. That formula cortisol manager that we've been using for something that has magnolia and other things in it, ashwagandha, etc. The usual suspects, I should say. That fantastic formula, and that cortisol manager really helps to bring down when it's high. We want to try to bring it down.
It's so good, so effective.
And licorice, these things can help. That can be sort of balancing one way or the other.
Right.
Many times with adrenals, when things are low, we just the patient needs to eat. They need to go to bed on time. There's a lot of lifestyle that kind of goes on with the treatment, getting salt in their diet again, eating regularly to take away the pressure on the adrenals, because the adrenals have to kick in when your blood sugar is low. So if you're constantly exhausted with the adrenals, then we want to be able to regulate that. So
and avoiding low-fat diets.
Right. Yeah, nourishing, getting plenty of vitamin C. The adrenals just suck up vitamin C, the B vitamins in general, B5,
B5,
magnesium,
vitamin C.
So those are the usual suspects. And all of those should be a foundation. And for our patients, when we're treating them, it very much is the sort of foundational approach. The lifestyle and these sort of nutritional, nutraceutical, and herbal approaches, great.
Yeah. So before you go on to the hydrocortisone, because that involves the physician, I think it's really important for the person to understand probably all Americans need to be on a good B complex, methylated. I think you might as well just go for a methylated.
Yes.
You have to let's just assume that you have problems with methylation. I don't think it's necessarily worth testing out of pocket, that test. The vitamin C, like you mentioned, the magnesium, which is another nutrient that and we do check it, most patients are going to be either low or suboptimal.
Mm-hmm.
And then zinc, which you can also check.
Yes.
But for people out there, if you're looking for just a general formula for that. And then the other big thing that you mentioned on what can you do right away is if you're not having some sort of protein and fat rich snack about every 3 to 4 hours, immediately start doing that.
Yeah. So foundational things, I think that's fantastic general advice and foundational things for medical treatment. Yeah. But there are times where we're seeing patients that are really, really off, and we believe and have prescribed for many, many years bioidentical or actual hydrocortisone, cortisol.
Physiologic dose.
And that's important because the adrenals will make somewhere between 10 upwards of 40, but probably 20 odd milligrams or so of cortisol per day. And the physiologic doses are roughly between 5 milligrams up to about 20 milligrams spread out throughout the day. And it's incredibly safe. And unfortunately, cortisol, or let's say steroids, this is when we say the steroid use and prednisone, and we think those kind of things. And it has a negative connotation, well, for a reason. When it was first invented or discovered, they were using it for everything. And they were giving massive doses for a long period of time. This was a detriment to the immune system. It was thinning out skin, and bones. I mean, it was just kind of wrecking people. It was a miracle at first, and then on the long-term high doses, very, very bad in the long run. So we know what the detriment is. Actually, having a swollen cortisol face and all these.
Right, and it's again, that's talking about steroids at high doses over extended periods of time.
Right. And so then they invented prednisone and those types of, more potent versions of the actual bioidentical hormone.
Yeah.
And, prednisone is about four times as potent, right? As milligram to milligram. So when we're not dealing with prednisone. But I will say this, and this is because a lot of patients experience the benefits of it inadvertently. They will be put on a Medrol dose pack, is pretty common, or some kind of prednisone. Maybe they had an infection, ear infection, something, and they just got put on it. And they said, wow, when I was put on that prednisone for that handful of days, I felt amazing.
Yeah.
Because it is giving you energy. And often whenever they do feel that significantly good on those types of medications, it's because they actually probably would benefit from a physiological amount of the bioidentical
So if you've
hormone.
experienced that, if you're a listener and you're saying, God, that happened to me, then really ask yourself, maybe this is something I should get tested.
Sure. Yeah. And we never prescribe the hydrocortisone unless we've had that salivary testing.
Right.
And that seems to help guide us of when they need it. Sometimes the patient seems like, wow, you're going to think this person is crawling in here. They're really exhausted. It's probably super low, and it isn't, or it's not exactly when you would think it is. So it really does help to guide that. But the hydrocortisone, incredibly safe to use. I really want to emphasize that for everyone, that physiologic doses that we're discussing between 5 and 20 milligrams in a day of the actual hydrocortisone is incredibly safe. It can be used, there's a great book by Dr. Jeffries, The Many Uses of Cortisol. I highly recommend people checking that out. It's been out for years. And things like, we use it for jet lag. If you're getting sick, a little bit of hydrocortisone can kind of help stimulate the immune system. Again, between 5 to 20 milligrams in a given day for a few days is very reasonable to do. And can be quite helpful.
And the thing about using hydrocortisone when a person is having this adrenal dysfunction or really adrenal fatigue is that because you're getting it from an outside source, right? You're getting cortisol in a pill. You're allowing your body a little bit of reprieve so that it can reconstitute that shriveled up adrenal. It's part of the healing process, not because you're going to be on this hydrocortisone forever, because you're literally rehabilitating your adrenal system and the adrenal glands itself so that it can worry about taking care of itself and healing itself while you're still having your cortisol demands met.
Yeah, that's a great point. So on average, we'll see patients on the hydrocortisone 3 to 6. It's usually not much more than 12 months, but 3 to 6 months of doing that while they're doing all these other things. They're doing the lifestyle. We're explaining all of these things to them. Often other hormones are being balanced. Other things are being taken care of. And it's amazing what.
And you started this whole episode by talking about, you said stress. and I was like, oh yeah, because the stressors in our life, they're everywhere. Some of them can be eliminated, just flat out eliminated. Many of them can't. They're stressors, they're responsibilities. They're not necessarily bad, but they're still stressors. So you have to then be thinking, okay, well, what am I doing so that this stressor isn't having such a harsh effect on my health? And also keep in mind that sometimes a stressor, like let's say little kids or a job, they're not even really the source of the problem, but so many other things are depleting you that it makes it harder for you to manage those responsibilities gracefully.
You always seem to bring it all together
and
in a fantastic summary way. So I can't say any better. I love you. Until next time.